Hello, my name is Dallas Greenaway. I am the middle school pastor here at Fellowship Greenville, and I want to welcome you to Six Rise. It looks way different than normal. I'm in an empty room. It's a little awkward, just me and the camera. And now you. Thanks for joining us. It is definitely a different, interesting time, continues to be during this global pandemic, but we are very thankful for avenues like this one through video where we can still get what will hopefully be some helpful content to you when it comes to your sixth grader and the changes that they're going through, the changes that because they're changing now your household is going through. And hopefully you find something, some nugget in here today in our discussion over the next few minutes that will help you navigate this next phase of life. And it's a new phase. It's a new season. In fact, going from an elementary schooler to being a middle schooler is said by all the scientists and people who are way smarter than me, doctors and researchers, it is said to be the biggest time of transition in your life, second only to birth. Think about that, from being like umbilical corded up in the womb and coming out, like now you're experiencing life for the very first time, like true outside the womb life, all the different smells and sights and sounds and crying as a baby. That's a massive change. I've been through it now with two little ones, with two boys. But second to birth is this transition from elementary school to middle school. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And specifically in two main ways. I think that you already know about the body. And if you want more information on that, I could ask you, but maybe it's a good time to ask your parents about all the changes in the middle school body. I'm just kidding. That's a joke. But obviously they're growing hair in different places and they're going to have growth spurts, which I never had, but so be it. There's all kinds of different things that are changing in their bodies, but the big one we're going to talk about today in regards to their bodies is their brain. And then we're also going to talk for just a few minutes about the changes that are happening with them socially. We could talk about all the emotions and all the other things that are changing, but those are the two big things: what's happening in the brain and what's happening to them socially, right? So as we jump into that, I do want to read from the scriptures, Psalm 139. I'm going to read verses 13 and through 16. So this is from God. Hopefully this is comforting to you straight from the scriptures, that these changes as they're happening, especially when it comes to their bodies and their brains, like we're going to talk about here in a moment, these God's not surprised by. In fact, it's part of how he's designed us. We all go through these changes during this phase of our lives. So Psalm 139 verse 13, for you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. So these changes, whether it's in their body or in their brain or socially, or however the changes come, some of them are designed from the beginning by God, and none of them are surprising to him, right? He's wired your kid the way he has for specific reasons. And from what we see in this psalm right here, those reasons are wonderful. Fearfully and wonderfully made. God has not made a mistake in how he's wired your child. And so we're going to talk about that as we jump into the brain. And maybe you're already getting some of this right now, where your kid is starting to distance themselves. They're starting to talk a little bit different, act a little bit different, make more and more questionable decisions. And you're like, why is this happening? And the big reason this is occurring is because their brain is actually kickstarting. Yes, you heard me right. Their brain really hasn't been functioning quite the way it's supposed to, and now it's kickstarting and working its way towards really becoming a fully functional brain. And this process is going to continue until they're almost 25 years old. This is their prefrontal cortex that I'm talking about. This is the part of their brain that is kickstarting. And there's going to be a list that's going to come up on the screen right now for you that shows you, here's what the prefrontal cortex controls. It controls the executive functions, which are alertness and attention. So think about these for each of your your kids, right? If you have multiple kids who are going through middle school or just one, think about this for your child. Alertness and attention is kickstarting. They're planning and forethought. It's not all there yet, and it's going to take a while. Remember, I said until they're 25. Priority setting. Working memory needed to complete reason and comprehension in learning. Prefrontal cortex has to do with regulating appropriate social behavior. Never experienced inappropriate social behavior in middle schoolers, have we? And then the last couple that we have listed are regulating emotional control. So maybe you've seen emotions going a little haywire as they're figuring this thing out. And then multitasking. It kind of doesn't exist, at least very well for middle schoolers, right? This is a list and not an exhaustive one of what the prefrontal cortex controls. And part of what's happening in their brains is that all of these things are kickstarting. And so they're figuring out how, like, what does it take for me to pay attention? What does it take for me to be actually appropriate in social behaviors? And they're gonna test things. They're gonna run trials of things, a little trial and error here as their brains are developing. And part of your role as a parent in their life is to help them navigate these messy waters. And so it's gonna lead to some awkward conversations between you and them, some awkward interactions, some blow up moments potentially as you guys are going at each other and you're like, why don't you understand? Can't you just get it? Can't things just click? I wish that it was that simple. But as I've already mentioned multiple times, this is a process that is kickstarting and will get better over the years, but it takes until the mid-20s for this whole process to finish. So maybe, hopefully, this is already helping you see like, oh, that's why my high schooler still sometimes acts like a middle schooler, right? Or maybe it's preparing you for, okay, I've heard the horror stories. I've heard about these things. It's normal. Let me say that again, it's normal. And so maybe now you can prepare yourself as your middle schooler will surely encounter some of these things as well. And we know that the spectrum of the intensity or extremity that you will experience in each one of these things is going to be different depending on your kid. But let me remind you that this change is completely normal. Their brain's developing. That's a good thing, even if it takes longer than we want. And none of this is surprising to God. In fact, it's how he's designed us in a lot of ways. So as you're navigating this changing brain with your middle schooler, let me challenge you to bring in my first big word of the day, which is grace. Grace. I actually talked to, a few years back, a parent who had an 8th grade son at the time. And he essentially told me, I don't understand why he doesn't listen to me. I don't understand why he doesn't just follow the rules and do what I tell him to do. I don't understand why he doesn't act like an adult because he's as big as one, right? He's as big as one. He's already, 6 foot whatever and 180 something pounds, and he's an 8th grader. He looks like an adult. Why does he not act like one? And I'm telling you, so much of it comes down to this right here, that their brains are still developing, and that 8th grader has only had like 2-3 years of the kick-started brain development. That's why. And so if you can remember that when you're getting into these Christian disagreements or Christian discussions, as Mike Hawkins likes to call them, these arguments, these blow up moments, these frustrated moments with your child, if you can remember this is a part of the process, I think that you might be able to have some grace on them, especially when you think about what your relationship with God looks like and how, man, there's been so many times where, at least for myself, I'll speak for me, I've disobeyed. I'm not listening. I just don't get it when it comes to God and the life that he's calling me to, or specific things he's inviting me into. I just don't get it and I won't do it. I want to go my own way. And your child's going to be like that as well. Can we have the same kind of grace that God's had with us? Can we have that with our children? So their brains are changing. Remember grace in the midst of the brain changes. And maybe you can add all the body changes in there too. The second big thing that is changing is socially. Things are changing for them. They are potentially moving from elementary school, like an actual physical one school. Now they're moving to a different location with different kids, with different teachers, with different class schedules. Now they're jumping between going from one period to the next, and they're having to figure that out. They're having to figure out who are my new friends. There's also this thing happening with them where they're starting to get a little more, I want to be independent, mom and dad. And maybe that's where the locking themselves in their bedroom comes in, or just wanting to get away, wanting to be distant. And you're like, no, my child, my baby. I can only imagine what that's like, especially as a parent of just young ones right now. But again, it is a natural part of the process. They will naturally move towards wanting more independence, wanting more freedom. And part of your role as a parent is over time to release and allow that to happen. But you need to still be aware you still are able to play a big enough role to know who their closest friends are and to have conversations with them about that. One of the biggest things we invite you to do during this period of life is make sure there's an outside voice, like a small group leader or a youth pastor or an awesome neighbor or a family friend who is an older person who's going to say basically the exact same things as you to your child, but because it's coming from somebody else and not from you, now your kid's actually going to listen. Who are the trusted voices that you can bring in to your middle schooler's life and have them saying the same truths that you do every day and you have been since they were born, but for some reason, God chooses to use different folks to make things click, right? So just be thinking about socially when it comes to actual physical people. And then there's all kinds of things we could talk about when it comes to now some of them aren't physically in classes, right? They're all digital. And so think about the effects that has on their relationships, on them socially. And then you got to add in 2020, this whole other component of the internet and social media. And there is so much that we could talk about here. I want to make sure you know that if you have questions about social media and about this app or that app, let us be a resource for you to help navigate. That's what we want to do when it comes to partnering with you. We want to be a resource. We want to be a help. We want to be a sounding board. We want to be a support system, a counselor if needed, to help you navigate this ever-changing world of social media and the internet age that we live in. And maybe for the first time, your middle schooler is going to jump headfirst into that realm, and they need your help in navigating it. They need your help in navigating it. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to say things online that they never would say to somebody's face. But let me remind you again, as you're going through this ever-changing social thing and you're trying to figure it out, let me remind you of this word again, is grace. And maybe in this one, more than any other, you need to have grace on your child, but also on yourself. It's a messy thing to try to figure out this new age that we live in. We're not always going to get it right all the time. It is something that's so hard to keep up with, to keep pace with. But again, you are the primary influencer in your child right now, and God has entrusted you as the one who is best equipped to do this role. You're still called to parent your child even in their changing social structure. So have grace with your kid as they make mistakes with different people and as they try to navigate this changing social structure, and have grace on yourself as you help them navigate it as well. So two big changing things. We want to be here as you navigate both of them, brains changing and social structure changing. And then here's kind of one big overarching word for this entire phase, with all the things changing, with all the stuff happening, with COVID included. Here's the biggest thing that you need to be looking for moments to do and going after with your child, and it is affirming them. Affirming them. I almost said affirmation. So it's affirmation, right? It's looking for ways to say, hey, I know your brain's changing. I know your body's changing. I know your friendships are changing. I know all of these things right now are changing in your life. But let me be the biggest voice and the biggest champion of reminding you who you are, of affirming, like, hey, you are so good at math, or you were so kind to your brother or sister, or wow, you have really been obedient to your mom and dad. Affirming who they are, how they're wired. You're so good at sports. You're so good at music, and building them up, encouraging them, and then also affirming them in who they are in Christ. You know, God's designed you to love others, and he's designed you to love him. God's made you a child of his, and no one can take that identity away from you. So look for ways to affirm in the midst of all the change. They're looking for something to plant their feet on right now, right? Their brains, bodies, social structures, emotions, physical, like everything is changing. Maybe even there's shakeups in your family that we haven't even begun to talk about. Maybe it's divorce, or maybe dad's new job, or maybe you've just moved into a new house. There's all kinds of things that could be shaky in your family. And maybe from your lips, from your heart and your mind, your love for your child, you can provide a firm foundation of reminding them, hey, here's where you're gifted, here's where you're good at, here's how God has wired you. And then also here's who you are in him, right? So we actually have a helpful resource for you to use as you are affirming your child. It is known as our Affirmation Award or our Affirmation Certificate. And we actually want you, as odd as this might be, as foreign as it might be, we want you to consider doing this with your child, right? So we're going to put it on the screen right now, and I'm going to walk you through this Affirmation Award, all right? Says, in recognition of outstanding display of blank. This is where you are going to choose a few things. Could be 1, 2, 3, or 4 things, as many things as you want to affirm your child in. Could be some of the ones I listed or something that came to your mind. But in the line underneath that, you're going to put the things you are affirming, right? And these are things that you've seen maybe over the last few weeks, or could be the last few years, or just could be the first thing that God brings to your mind. You're like, wow, I haven't thought about that in a long time. So let's take a look at this Affirmation Award together. The first part you're going to see is in recognition of outstanding display of, and the blank right underneath that is where you're going to write some of the things that you want to affirm your child in. And right here, just keep it to a word or a phrase. Maybe you just want to affirm them in the ways that they are gifted. And so it could be sports or music, and or some of the other things that we talked about. It could also be just their character, and you want to remind them of, wow, the servant's heart that you've displayed, or the generosity that you've displayed in your life, and just reminding them of how they're wired, how they're made, how God's designed them, and affirming them in those things, right? And then the lines at the bottom of the page, there's 3 lines down there. That's actually where you're going to share either, you could do a couple of things with this actually. You could write why you are affirming them in those areas. And so maybe you give examples of, man, here's where I've seen you loving your brother or sister really well. Or these lines could be your prayer for them as they move forward in this next phase of life through their middle school years. You could just write out a prayer and some of your hopes for them as they go through this next phase. The circles in the middle are kind of to give you guys some talking points once you hand them this reward. And it's to remind them not just of how they're wired, how they're designed, but help them understand that life is meant to be lived with God, abiding in him. And these may be some talking points for you to go through. Talk about, what does it look like for them as a middle schooler, maybe for you guys even as a family, to hear, to listen to God's word. Are you guys making that a regular part of your family rhythm, your daily routine? You guys can talk about praying, having dialogue with God, and what that looks like in our lives right now, or in your life right now. You can remind them about talking about their faith, sharing their faith, or as it says here, articulating. And so maybe this can get some discussions going in your house about faith, maybe some discussions that haven't happened yet. And then this last piece is a reminder to live a life of worship, to worship with our lives, or as Romans 12 tells us or reminds us that our lives are meant to be a living sacrifice. And so those may be some jumping off points for you to discuss with your child as you hand them this Affirmation Award. And then at the bottom, if you want to, you can sign it or say with love. And the idea here is not necessarily that they would display it in their room and that, it would be, man, I got my affirmation diploma, but it just would be a simple, tangible way of you going to your child, maybe for the first time in a long time, reminding them who they are in Christ, reminding them of how they're gifted and that you see them, and just providing some sort of stable foundation or stability in their life right now to work from in the midst of all the things that are changing. So That is all that I have for you in this video. I hope that you found, again, some helpful nuggets as you think through the ways that your child is changing. I hope that this is not overwhelming. I want to remind you that you are not alone, that all the changes that you are experiencing or will experience are normal, and that we are here as a resource support system, as people who love you and want to walk beside you. We're here if and when you need us. So don't hesitate to reach out. Don't hesitate to ask questions. Don't hesitate to just come and say, just word vomit and say, this is what's happening. What am I supposed to do? We're here for you. We love you. We're in this phase together.